Tonight we're welcoming Marianne Elliott, our distinguished guest speaker for our second summit. Marianne is a writer, she is a peacekeeper, and she's an activist. Marianne is the daughter of missionaries. She spent her early years living in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, and then grew up on a dairy farm in New Zealand. These must have really shaped her, these early experiences in life, because she's gone on to become an advocate, a peacemaker. She is an advocate for human rights in particular, and really is very focused on fighting gender-based violence. Her talk tonight is focused on her experiences in Afghanistan, finding peace where it seems there is only conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, Marianne Elliott.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all. Ko Mangatauteri te maunga. I belong to the mountain that is called Mangatauteri. Ko Waiho te awa. I belong to the river that is called Waiho. Ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi. I belong to the tribe that is called Ngāti Pākehā. Nor Ireland, Scotland, Denmark, ko nor Sweden, o ko tipuna. My ancestors came from Ireland, Scotland, Denmark and Sweden. Nor Aotearoa ahau. I am from Aotearoa, New Zealand, the land of the long white cloud. Ko Marianne toku ingoa. My name is Marianne. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you so much for having me. Ngā mihi nui kia koe, Rangatira Lincoln. Thank you particularly to you, Mr. Lincoln, without whom I wouldn't be here. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou ngā rangatira o Claremont Lincoln. Thank you to all of you, the elders and people of Claremont Lincoln. Thank you to President Arada for your introduction, and to you, Laura, for your lovely words and some hints about the beginnings of my path. And I also want to thank Whitney Braun, without whom I wouldn't be here. I met Whitney at her parents' B&B when Lucas, my partner, and I were on holiday in Yosemite about 5.5 years ago. And so that's where the seed of tonight was planted. So thank you for helping bring this to be. All right. Who am I? I, as well as being of the tribe Ngāti Pākehā, which, if you don't know, Ngāti Pākehā are the white people, if you can't tell. I'm from the tribe in New Zealand that is known as the white people, and I come from a long line of do-gooders and adventurers, known also as missionaries. That's me, right in the front of the picture, looking perplexed. I actually don't remember this photo being taken, so anything I tell you about what I was thinking or feeling would be entirely fabricated. But I did spend quite a lot of my childhood feeling a little perplexed, because as Laura mentioned, I spent some of the early years of my life in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, which is where this photo was taken, and then spent the next part of my life in rural New Zealand on a dairy farm, which was startlingly different. These are some of my ancestors. In the top left-hand corner, my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, Swedish and Danish by origin, born in New Zealand. This photo was taken in Papua New Guinea somewhere in the 1950s with my great-uncle Ashley at their feet. Beneath them, my grandfather. That photo was taken in Nigeria, because if my ancestors were anything, they were great travellers. So from New Zealand, they set off back across the oceans on a 6-month boat journey to Nigeria, where my father grew up, where my grandparents were missionaries. In the top right-hand corner, looking very comfortable and relaxed, you'll see that one of my uncles was wise enough to choose Guatemala as his mission. On the other side, my other uncle, Max, back in Papua New Guinea with a giant python. I think there's a chicken inside that python, actually. I think that's the point of the photo. Actually, I think this is a photo from when I was in Papua New Guinea. My mother told me she came out onto the front porch to find me transfixed by a giant python and showing no signs at all of alarm. So my poor mother had to call in Uncle Max. At the bottom again is a photo of myself looking off camera. I'm not sure who I'm looking at, and my older sister with the long pigtails, and two of our best friends in our childhood, one of whom you can see had polio as a child. He actually ended up coming to New Zealand at one point. I share this because this shaped me. These early experiences of my life shaped me. They shaped me in many, many ways. But for the purpose of this evening, I'm going to just talk about two of the ways in which they shaped me. The experience of travelling from New Zealand to Papua New Guinea and back again before I was 6 years old had the effect, firstly, of giving me the sense that all things were not equal in the world. And so from a very young age, I developed a strong sense of social justice, a strong sense of right and wrong. Some things that seemed to me just weren't fair. And as we'll explore more as I go on into this talk, there was a shadow to this sense of clear justice and injustice. There is both a beauty to recognising injustice when we see it, and also if we don't practice self-awareness and the ability to see beyond, I suppose, our own experiences of the world, that clarity can become quite cruel. Oh, that, by the way, as you can probably tell, is me. On the day that I was admitted to the High Court of New Zealand, I chose to be a lawyer, which seemed like an obvious choice if you had a clear sense of right and wrong. I am indeed wearing a horsehair wig, because we are still a colony of England. My horsehair wig was one of 4 that my law firm owned, and this one was called Ringo. I look happy because I am happy. As I'm quite young in this photo, I kind of was always in a hurry. My whole life I was in a hurry to get to the point where I would be making a difference in the world. So I kind of, sprinted through school and sprinted through university and was admitted to the High Court of New Zealand as a barrister of the High Court of New Zealand when I was 21. So yes, that's why such a youthful complexion. I was extremely young and had extremely limited experience of the world. Alongside this strong sense of social justice, my early years in Papua New Guinea also instilled in me an insatiable appetite for adventure and travel. And this has never gone away. And I see this as an extremely beautiful thing that my early years instilled in me, was a sense that not only was the world not all like New Zealand, and not only were there differences in opportunity and places where the resources were not as abundant as New Zealand, but it also taught me that there were places that had fabulous things that we didn't have in New Zealand. There were places with different languages that I could learn, different foods that I could eat, different religions that I could study, just different ways of being in the world that as a very young child, I think, without any particular attachment to one way of being in the world, that just set off in me this incredible appetite. And so I've continued in all my choices in life to always choose the path, if I could, that I felt gave me both an opportunity to contribute to greater justice and an opportunity to have an adventure. So that photo is actually of me standing in the Negev desert. I'm about 24 at this point, finished my law degree, worked for a few years in a big law firm in New Zealand to pay off my student loan, and then got a job working in the Gaza Strip for a Palestinian human rights lawyer whose name was Raji Sourani. Raji Sourani, some of you may have heard of him, he's a very well-known Palestinian human rights lawyer. He has been working in Gaza on Palestinian human rights issues for 3 decades. I had the privilege of working with Raji for 2 years. And I'm just going to read, actually, I'm going to kick off by reading a little bit from my book, Zen Under Fire, which is mostly about my time in Afghanistan, but also touches just for a moment on my time in Gaza. You might expect people who go to live and work in war zones to be thick-skinned types, for whom flak jackets and rocket fire are water off a duck's back. Not me. As a preschooler, I would get upset when other kids got hurt. I still get choked up at the sight of a proud man resisting help on the train. Despite my thin skin, however, I've ended up working in some of the most notorious conflicts of our time. I was in the Gaza Strip for 2 years, working for the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. My boss in Gaza was Raji Sourani, a famously resilient Palestinian human rights lawyer. The first time I burst into tears over a child killed by a rubber bullet, Raji said, "Oh, Marianne, if you want to do this kind of work, you're going to have to toughen up." You're going to have to grow a thicker skin. I worked with Raji for 2 years, and trust me, he did his best to toughen me up. He was an extraordinary man, but he could be a very tough man. And he really felt that the best service he could do to me was to teach me how to have a thicker skin. After 2 years, I left to move actually back to New Zealand, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights threw a morning tea for me. And really nobody does morning teas like Gazans, so it was wonderful. There was lots of food, lots of tea, and Raji gave a speech. And in his speech, he conceded that he had in fact failed miserably in his mission to toughen me up, and that I was as soft-hearted, he said, as the day I landed on his doorstep. And this is really where my story about finding peace in the middle of conflict begins. Because in Gaza, the message I was given initially was this softness, this permeousness in which you allow the suffering that is going on in the world and the feelings and experiences of other people to touch you. This is a problem. This is a problem and you should fix it. And so I went back to New Zealand, and I worked for 5 years at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, where there were significant issues to be worked on, but as you can imagine, the human rights issues in New Zealand, although not inconsiderable, are not don't operate in the same with the same level of kind of daily rawness as human rights in the Gaza Strip. And after 5 years in New Zealand, I was really feeling that itch again, the itch to not only be doing work that was of social significance, that helped in some meaningful way to make the world a better place, but also I was itching for adventure. I mean, I've learned to just admit that, right? That's part of who I am. So I moved to Afghanistan, and I thought, why not? Well, in the meantime, I should add that I'd been working for 3 years on and off in East Timor, which was at that time the newest democracy in the world. It was a place of an incredible sense of hopefulness. There were enormous frustrations. Many, many young Timorese people were deeply frustrated with the pace at which change was happening. But it was also a place that had a real sense of possibility. Things could change. But between East Timor and New Zealand, my adventure bone was bored, and so I moved to Afghanistan. And I really thought that I was ready for Afghanistan. I thought that life in Gaza had prepared me for Afghanistan. I was in Gaza in 2001 when the Al-Aqsa Intifada started. I lived through many days of Israeli helicopters hovering over our apartments, never knowing whether our building was the one to be shelled that day or not. I lived through having colleagues go home from work to find that their apartment building was gone and their family with it. In Gaza, I had a glimpse of what it feels like to live in a place where your life is governed by violence, and where you have little or no control over the extent to which that violence comes to your home. But here was the difference between Kabul and Gaza. For me, I was in Gaza in 2000, 2001. I went to Afghanistan in 2005. Whereas in Gaza, I felt utterly at home. In the city of Gaza, I was able to make my home. The people of Gaza were comfortable and felt safe inviting me in to their homes. And as long as I was in the streets of Gaza, surrounded by my Palestinian friends and colleagues, I felt safe. Danger when it came to Gaza came from the outside. And although when it came, it wreaked terrible havoc, once it left, I felt once again at home and safe. In Kabul, I never felt safe. And to a very great extent in Kabul, I was never able to feel at home because the people of Kabul were unable to feel safe inviting me into their homes. The political situation in Afghanistan was such that it was dangerous for my Afghan colleagues to invite a Haraji or foreigner like myself into their home. The risk was that somebody would see that they had a foreigner in their home, would tell somebody in the neighbourhood who was anti-government, anti-foreigners, and then my colleagues and their families would be at risk. So nothing prepared me for that. Nothing I had really experienced in Gaza or in East Timor prepared me for being in a place where my very presence, in a sense, posed a danger to the people who I intended to serve. It's a very complex kind of situation to be in. And I didn't really understand. I articulate that quite clearly and simply now, and at the time I didn't. I wasn't quite sure why I felt so often ill at ease in Afghanistan. This is Afghanistan. It's not all of Afghanistan looks like this. I could have shown you a beautiful picture of the extraordinary blue mosque in Herat. I could have shown you photos of urban, sophisticated Kabul. The reason I'm showing you a photo of these hillsides in Khor province is because this is where I lived for a good chunk of my time in Afghanistan, in a small town called Chakchiran, which is up in the mountains of the Hindu Kush. It's actually impossible to see in this photo, I'm realizing. Maybe not. If you go to the very end of the sort of beigey camel, before it turns into the kind of lighter colour, there's a ridge there. And up in the top corner of the ridge is Chakchiran town. We'd been walking for about 6 miles, so it's about 6 miles away there. Chakchiran town is a town of about 10,000 people. It's the provincial capital of the province of Khor province, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest, provinces in Afghanistan. And I was stationed there as the United Nations Head of Provincial Office within the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan. In itself, this was a difficult post for me to hold because up until this job, I had worked for human rights organisations. I had worked for organisations where the mandate and the ethical values by which decisions were made were founded in the international human rights documents. So there was a clarity. The United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan was a political mission. And they had a political mandate, which was to support and ensure the stability of the Afghan government. Sometimes that aligned well with human rights mandates, and sometimes it didn't at all. And so I found myself as a human rights advocate, often experiencing moments of quite intense conflict within my own role. In fact, I had some very heated debates with some of the senior political affairs officers in the mission who argued that human rights were disruptive to political stability and that it would disrupt the stability of the coalition government that President Karzai had put together too much were we to in fact pursue prosecution of the war crimes that I was collecting evidence of. So you can imagine the sort of inner conflict of spending your days meeting people who had been told that your mandate was to collect evidence. Oh, lost me. Karzai's listening. Thank you. All right. Anyway, I'm just going to figure out where I am. Okay. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of my book to resituate myself. Where are we? Here we go. So this is at the very beginning of my time with the United Nations Assistance Mission to Afghanistan. It's before I was transferred to Chakchiran. I was in the Herat office. And I went to the Herat office initially as a human rights officer, so within the realm that I was comfortable in. I hadn't been there very long, and I was asked to take on a responsibility that somewhat surprised me, and I'll read. So this is actually from 2006, which I now realise is a very long time ago. I'm a month into my new job as a human rights officer for the UN Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, and I'm not yet feeling on top of my game. But it is Eid, the holiday that follows the end of the month of Ramadan, and my colleagues are all desperate for a break. I'm about to be left in charge of the office. I'm not sure I'm ready for the responsibility, so I double check with my boss. I'm not backing out on you, I say, but I am having doubts about my ability to do this. He reassures me, "You'll be fine, Marianne. As long as no one kills Amanullah Khan, you'll be fine." His reassurance, I assume, is a joke. I have a lot to learn about Afghanistan. My boss leaves at 9 a.m. on Sunday, the 23rd of October, 2006. I am now the officer in charge of a United Nations office in the middle of a conflict zone. By midday, Amanullah Khan is dead. You probably, as I've said before, you probably saw that coming because as far as the story goes, the setup is there. I did not, and I was poorly equipped for the job that I was then thrust into. So Amanullah Khan was a significant tribal leader in the western region of Afghanistan in 2006. He was significant, at least in part, because he was one of the only tribal leaders. He was probably, perhaps the only tribal leader who had been willing to challenge publicly the power and authority of the man who was indisputably the most powerful political and tribal leader in Western Afghanistan at the time, whose name was Ismail Khan. So Amanullah Khan was a challenger to Ismail Khan, not to take over his position, they were from completely different ethnicities and tribes, but he was challenging the dominance of Ismail Khan's power in the Western region. So there was clearly the potential for dispute here. It's an extremely politically complex situation. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with what was happening in Western Afghanistan in 2006, some of you perhaps less so. For the purpose of my story tonight, the point is I knew little to nothing of that context at the moment when I was left in charge of the office, which is kind of extraordinary when you think about it, that somebody from New Zealand who had experience in Gaza and East Timor and 6 months in Kabul working specifically on women's rights issues would be left in charge of a regional office of the UN with this kind of tribal and political conflict brewing. The fact is, it happened. He was assassinated. In retaliation for his assassination, his men, the men who supported him, descended on the villages of a neighbouring tribe who were believed to be responsible for his assassination, and began to move from house to house, killing adult men and boys who were considered old enough to be fighters. Some of the people from that village responded and came out with arms and fought back. I was sitting in my office in Herat getting reports coming in through satellite phones of various reports of numbers of killings and thinking, what on earth can we usefully do at this point? Fortunately, I had some extremely wise and senior Afghan colleagues who were there with me, and on their advice, and on the advice actually also of some other UN colleagues who were in Kabul and in Kandahar, we proposed a variety of dialogue processes that the various tribal leaders could participate in, and we were able to dissuade the provincial head of the Afghan National Army from sending soldiers from Herat down, because the soldiers in Herat were loyal to Amanullah Khan, so we felt that was unlikely to be useful in diffusing the situation. I did my best. I represented the position that I had been advised to represent. Over the course of about 48 hours, the fighting was contained, and then the reconciliation process began. However, in that period of 48 hours, many, many, many people died, including, at the time I wasn't sure, but I knew at least 20, maybe up to 40 children. What happened there was that I experienced a complete crisis of confidence in the job that I was doing, the institution for which I was working, and the sort of modern field of politically negotiated peacekeeping as implemented by the UN. And that crisis of confidence had a very profound impact on me. It turned out that up until that moment in my life, it wasn't just that my job was built around the idea that I could do something good in the world. My very identity had been built on the idea that I could do something good in the world. And sitting underneath my identity, my sense of self-worth relied on my belief that I could do something good in the world. So when you come to the moment in your life where you have to look with clear eyes at the possibility that the work that you thought you were doing is not having the impact you thought it was having, that it might not only be not doing as much good, but it might even be doing harm. And that doesn't just unravel your career path, but it unravels the part of you that thinks you are worth being here. You're experiencing an existential crisis in the middle of a country where you have not yet any friends or family, where you can't go out and go for a long run, which is what my way of distracting myself from every major crisis up until that point. You're forced to deal with it. And I didn't deal with it very well. So I'm going to read a little. This is actually a picture of some of the families displaced by the fighting. So as well as the people who were killed that day, many, many families were displaced, and part of my job was to go and meet them, interview primarily the women who survived this attack, ask them in considerable detail about how their husbands were killed, ask them in detail about how their children had been killed. And as I was talking to Eileen, all of my training as a human rights lawyer was in the art of an interrogative questioning. So I was extremely skilled in trying to work out if you were telling me the truth or not. I was very good at spotting the holes in your story and trying to find out whether in fact the facts stacked up to a legal conclusion that I could take back for my reporting purposes. What I didn't understand at that point, what I knew nothing about at that point, was the way in which trauma registers in stories that often do not follow logical, consequential, and chronological processes. So here I was interviewing these women who had just experienced this incredible trauma, thinking, finally, I'm doing something good. I'm interviewing them, I'm getting evidence, we can prosecute the people who did this. And I'm interviewing them in a way that displays no understanding of the trauma they've experienced. That includes no skills or insight into the effect that that trauma would have on their ability to relay the story of what had happened. Partway through these interviews, a light bulb goes off for me. And it's interesting, I wonder why now? Why not in Gaza? Why not in East Timor? And I suspect it's because when I was doing these interviews, I was 34 years old. And I wonder whether somewhere between 24, arriving in Gaza, and 34, without having even attended such a fine program as this, I had begun to cultivate a little bit of self-awareness. And I had a moment of realizing what I was doing. The problem was I had nowhere to go with that realization. And so I turned it inward on myself into guilt. And it took me to a place that some people, many people perhaps, who have worked in around and with communities who are traumatised, or perhaps even just worked in any field where the gap between the need of the community that you are working with and the capacity that you have to meet that need is wide. Anybody who has lived in that gap will know that sense of sort of profound and inexplicable guilt. The problem, of course, is that if you have no skills, no tools, no practices, the clarity that comes with self-awareness can become really destructive. And that's really what happened to me. So I'm going to read you another extract. In the weeks following the killing in Shindand, I spent much of my time lost in a thick fog from which I began to think I would never emerge. My heart is full of emotion for the stories the women in Shindand told me in quiet understatement and without tears. I'm left with a great sadness that feels like a deep bowl of water balanced precariously within me. When I tip too far from centre, it begins to pour over the edges and the sadness floods me, drowning any feeling of hope or certainty. In an effort not to be overwhelmed, I try to hold myself very carefully to avoid tipping the bowl. But life in Afghanistan is bumpy, and there are inevitable spills. I don't really understand where the sadness is coming from. I've dealt with human suffering before, so why am I so affected now? Worse, I have no idea how to make it go away. At times it feels like a bottomless well. Will I ever feel anything other than sadness again? Along with the sadness, I'm filled with guilt. I feel terrible guilt that I've failed the mothers in Shindand. There is the irrational yet persistent guilt that we were unable to protect their sons in the first place. On top of that, I now also fear that my interviews have not achieved enough good to justify the pain they might have caused the women. I've written up my report and submitted it to my boss, together with an impassioned plea that the views of these women and all the women affected by the fighting be taken into account in our office's efforts to resolve the conflict. But the perfunctory responses I receive make me deeply sceptical that anyone is paying attention. Have I, in my naivety, subjected these women to unnecessary suffering? So here I am, clarity has come, but I don't have really the next essential skill to deal with clarity. And it takes me quite some time to even get the notion that there might be a way to live with this clarity other than despair and a kind of self-cruelty. And eventually I get the hint of this other way when I encounter the teachings of actually a Buddhist teacher called Pema Chodron. And I also want to read to you a little from my book about what happens when I encounter Pema's teaching. So let me see if I can find this one for you. Here we go. So between the situation in Shindand, where I interviewed these women, realised halfway through the interviews that perhaps I was re-traumatising them, or at least causing them some form of suffering, and then realised that my early formed sense of justice, which was that their views must be heard, these men must be prosecuted, had perhaps overridden my ability in that moment to perceive what was needed. Between that and where I'm about to read, I had switched my attention slightly and come at least to this understanding that maybe my best chance of being of use in Afghanistan was to sort of let fall all ideas I had of what I was supposed to be there to do and just ask people. Just like ask the women, what do you need from me? And when I arrived in a new province where I was supposed to be, inspecting all of the prisons, just ask a whole range of people in that community, what could the UN mission actually do to help you? And this radical approach of asking what might be needed eventually produced a very clear answer, which was people really wanted some training in the area I was working on, which was in violence against women. The police, the prosecutors, and the judges all wanted some training in how to respond to gender-based violence within the Afghan legal system. So this was really a wonderful opportunity for me. I was able to find a teacher in Kabul who was involved in teaching the prosecutors, who was an expert in Sharia law, who could come and talk about how both Afghan civil law, criminal law, and Sharia law provided the opportunity for police, for prosecutors, and for the courts to in fact respond within the legal system to violence against women. It's actually one of the times when Lucas and I sort of first connected, when I couldn't get any funding for the UN for this workshop because it didn't fall within our official mandate. So I wrote to my friends and family in New Zealand, and they provided the funds for me to do that. I was like, this is what the people here actually want. So can you help me fund it? Which they did, and Lucas was one of the people who did that. Yeah, thanks. So that was really, it was really quite a boost to my sense of sort of optimism, but it hadn't resolved the core disconnect between what happens when you see yourself and the world with great clarity and have nothing to balance that clarity. So, and most insidiously, what I realised was that I was really giving myself a hard time about anything I felt, any of my bad feelings. And this is from my book again. All of my colleagues seem to cope with the tragedies unfolding around us with so much less drama than I do. I want to know when I'm going to get over myself and just get on with it. Harshest of all is the voice in my own head telling me I have no reason to be depressed or anxious. I have a warm home and more than enough food to eat. My family is safe from war and I have a good job. I have no right to feel bad. This voice is so insistent that I immediately back away from any examination or even acknowledgement of my darker feelings. I learn to avoid the silence in which they would arise. I distract myself, I work, I watch Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But the quiet moments still creep up on me when I'm practicing yoga or trying to sleep at night, and my mind rushes to fill the silence with thoughts about what I've done wrong and how I could do better in my work. I may have stepped back from the precipice of depression I was hovering on, but I am far from making peace with myself. I am no closer to fully embracing Raji Surani's celebration of my sensitivity as a strength. I am more troubled than ever by the voices in my head that tell me to stop being such a crybaby. I decide to try meditation. I have an idea that meditation will teach me to quiet the voices in my head, that I will rise above my own dramas and find some kind of peaceful, transcendent state. I have a tape of guided meditation that my cousin gave me before I came to Afghanistan, so I start listening to it as part of my morning routine. I persevere, although it is difficult, convincing myself that in time it will either get easier or I will get more disciplined. In fact, in the short term at least, neither is true. My mind is as disciplined as a frisky puppy. No matter how many times I grab it by the scruff of the neck or coax it more gently and return it to the object of my meditation, it always runs off again. I begin to suspect meditation just isn't for me. Out of desperation, I dig out some CDs that my yoga teacher gave me. They are recordings of Buddhist nun Pema Chodron reading a book she wrote about meditation called Going to the Places That Scare You. As I listen to the CD, Pema speaks directly to me. She describes my feelings and fears so accurately that you would have thought she wrote the entire book just for the benefit of one confused human rights officer in Afghanistan. Pema says, "The purpose of meditation is not to make us feel better. If we expect that," she explains, "we'll end up thinking we are doing it wrong." Well, yes, I think, precisely. That's been my experience. Instead, she explains, meditation takes us just as we are, with all of our confusion. It's not a process of self-improvement, she insists, but a process of self-acceptance. This is a radical thought for me. I hadn't realised how deeply wedded I am to the idea of improving myself. Even in my yoga practice, it had quickly become another territory in which to improve myself. But sitting with myself, exactly as I am, tears, confusion and all, is revolutionary. I'm coming to see that there is no value in turning my morning meditation into yet another space in which to berate myself for not being good enough. I want to be a source of compassion, kindness, and peace in the world. And I can start by offering compassion, kindness, and peace to myself. So it is that in the midst of my greatest inner turmoil, and in the midst of one of the most notorious conflict zones of the world, I begin to make some kind of peace with myself. It is only when I can be just as I am, without harshness and without deception, that my meditation becomes a transformative process. So I decide to meditate every morning, no matter what messy state I wake up in. I decide, because I'm like this, to meditate for 21 days. And as the 21st day comes and goes, I realise I don't want to stop. Some days, these mornings on my cushion are calming and restorative. Other days, they feel like a battleground. Whichever it is, I find a deep reassurance in the simple mantra I repeat to myself: just sit. right, I have a couple more photos. I just love to have some photos of, I'm going to pull this off actually and step to the side of it. The woman on the left is a woman who was also one of the families who had to flee their homes, living in the tents that you saw with the little girl. When I first met them, winter was coming, the snow was approaching. This is a photo 3 months. When I first met them, she was pregnant. She had her baby in the tents. This is the photo taken on the day when they moved into their new homes, which is why she looks happy. The other photo is of a young girl in a school in a very remote part of Chakchiran. I like to share it because one of the things that I experienced, at least in the part of Afghanistan where I primarily worked, was an extraordinary appetite and hunger of almost all of the parents I met for education for their children. And so where the schools were available, and particularly where specialist girls' school were available, even in very remote and hard to access parts of the province, the schools were like rammed with children. This school had a tent, and had a tent for each age group, and the first entry level of 5 and 6-year-old girls, there were 50 girls in the classroom, and they were very patient learners, I have to say. I don't know that the 5 and 6-year-olds I know in New Zealand would deal with the patience they had to show. On the left-hand side, 2 boys from the orphanage in Chakchiran in Kor province. It was a really significant project for me because it was an example of how good intentions can sometimes lead to unintended poor outcomes. There were the wives of the NATO generals. So the NATO generals, the NATO forces at that point were heavily involved in Afghanistan. The wives of the NATO generals had raised a whole lot of money, and one of the places they decided to spend it was in Chakchiran, which was wonderful because it was a very poorly resourced province, and they decided to spend it upgrading this orphanage. And I found out about it through a friend, an Afghan friend in Chakchiran, who was very concerned about this. And so one of my jobs at that point was to use my dialogue skills to convince the wives of the NATO general that rather than upgrading the orphanage, most of the children in this orphanage, by the way, have family. They may not have fathers, many of them have mothers, most of them will have uncles or aunts, and all of the evidence is that they will have a better life if they live in the homes of their aunts and uncles or grandparents or extended family. So we convinced the wives of the NATO generals to build a children's centre with a school, and if the children attended the school, then they could take home oil and flour and rice to the families, which would enable families to reintegrate children into their homes. On the other side is another one of the boys from the families who were forced to flee their homes. I really just like this photo because he's so beautiful. And I think it's a good photo. I'm quite proud of it. It's quite nice lighting. And I also really like the expression on his face. He's looking at me, right? He's really like, who are you? And why are you taking my photograph? And then we had a chat afterwards. So the first piece for me of what I needed to learn in Afghanistan was the curiosity piece. The first piece was the courage to ask questions that I didn't know the answer to. And the first of those questions was, are we doing any good here? And it really took a lot of courage to ask that question. And I have a picture here of some guys who I knew, and young guys in Chakchiran, because they were extremely curious. And so they were good role models for me of curiosity. So the first quality I needed to cultivate was curiosity, which took a lot of courage. Because true curiosity means stepping into the unknown. And it's a very vulnerable place to be. The next quality I needed to cultivate was courage. And this is the courage specifically to see things as they really are. Because once you ask the question to which you don't know the answer, you may see that the answer is something you didn't want to know. And so I chose this photo because I felt this little girl, she's not looking right at me here, but I felt she looked at me with a lot of clarity. And she saw something of the inequality in our relationship when I show up in the big UN car and take photos. And I felt that this little girl had the clear seeing.
But here was the real clincher for me. Without compassion, living with the kind of clarity that enables us to see ourselves and the world as they really are, might destroy us. Like, clarity without compassion is a really cruel place to live. And so the next quality that I had to cultivate was this deep compassion, and I had to start with some sort of compassion for myself. So this is the question I was asking myself during this time in Afghanistan. What are the qualities I need to cultivate to lead ethical, effective and sustainable change? And for me, amongst many others, they were these: curiosity, courage, clarity and compassion. And so the next question for me was, what are the practices that help me cultivate those qualities? And I have a photo of myself doing yoga because it's way more aesthetic than a photo of doing meditation, because there's a reflection and it's really pretty. But for me, the practice, some form of mindfulness-based practice, was really absolutely core to my ability to cultivate those qualities. But it didn't stop there. The other piece, as I was talking to somebody about today, is the other piece of it for me was collaboration. The other piece was always working with people with whom I have the kind of deep, trusting relationship where I can ask them hard questions, where they know they have the permission to tell me when they see me going off track, where I know if I need to step out for a little while because I'm tapped out, somebody can carry the baton for me. It's not all on me. So that gives me the space to make healthy choices. Collaboration to me is what took all of this sort of personal work and transformed it into a sustainable form of leadership. I wanted to finish with these guys and one last reading from the book. These are my colleagues in Chakcharan. They're all from Chakcharan, they're all local. You might notice some lack of diversity in the makeup of our team. I might stand out just a little bit in the photo. I pulled this photo out when I was writing my book. When I was writing my book, one of my friends and colleagues who I had worked with in Afghanistan, who was the head of the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission office in Chakcharan. I worked with him very, very closely on a number of human rights cases. He was kidnapped by the Taliban. He was actually travelling. He was on the road south from Chakcharan on his way down to his home in Kandahar, and he was kidnapped. And I was very hopeful at the time that he would somehow, the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission would negotiate for his release. But I also knew there was a very good chance that that was it and I would never see him again. So I went into my photos to find a photo of this man. And I couldn't find a photo of him. What I found instead was this photo. And I looked at it for quite some time. And when I look at this photo, I see 10 Afghan men gazing solemnly at the camera. It's winter, as you can see, late December. And they're all wearing heavy coats and scarves and their cotton tunics. Their hands are tucked into their warm pockets or crossed demurely in front of their chests. In the centre of the photo is a young woman with long black hair pulled into a ponytail. She's dressed in jeans and a long black shawl. A bright red and pink scarf around her neck brings the only patch of colour to the scene. And unlike all the others in the photo, she is smiling because she was trained to do so. Other than her smile, there is no real sign of warmth between the people in the photo. There is no clue that the man standing next to her wearing a brown coat over a crisp white cotton tunic and pants has been one of her closest confidants for the past 6 months. There is no sign of the friendship that will continue to bind these two people together many years after the photo is taken. As a souvenir of friendship, it is an unsatisfying photo. But I still like to look at it. It reminds me of a place I called home for a time and the people who made it so.